A subtle tension permeated the corridors of power in these hours, but the quiet was misleading. Reports began circulating that Russia's strategic missile postures had triggered unexpected international reactions, far exceeding the anticipated scope of signaling. Official statements stressed routine exercises and deterrence protocols, yet in expert circles, analysts cautioned that the situation was spiraling beyond conventional bounds. Observers noted that the alignment of deployments, readiness alerts, and diplomatic responses suggested a miscalculation whose consequences could extend well beyond Moscow. By this stage, intelligence indicated that several nuclear-capable units were in heightened alert, with movements closely monitored by satellite and electronic surveillance. Public messaging emphasized control and normalcy, but privately, senior officials were reportedly reassessing operational directives to prevent escalation. The divergence between the official narrative and operational reality created a palpable sense of unease. Analysts familiar with Kremlin strategy noted that such discrepancies rarely appeared without deeper systemic factors at play. In the capitals of allied nations, analysts were quietly recalibrating threat assessments. The sudden alignment of Russian nuclear assets, coupled with ambiguous statements regarding readiness and doctrine, prompted urgent consultations. These discussions, conducted outside the public eye, were designed to evaluate potential responses and preempt unintended escalation. Between these channels, a clear pattern emerged. The day's events had exposed both operational rigidity and the limits of centralized control. Meanwhile, monitoring units reported anomalies in command and control communications that were subtle but notable. Signals intelligence suggested deviations from standard verification protocols, raising questions about the coherence of decision-making chains. Official explanations remained consistent with prior exercises, but the observable behavior of deployed assets indicated potential friction between strategic intent and operational execution. The situation was unfolding under the veneer of calm, yet the undercurrents suggested an unanticipated risk was rapidly crystallizing. On the financial side, markets sensitive to geopolitical tensions began to register fluctuations. While official assessments minimized the perceived threat, commodity and defense-linked indices reflected heightened volatility. Traders and analysts in major financial hubs noted the interplay between public messaging and real-time intelligence, underscoring how perception alone could amplify strategic missteps. The simultaneous escalation of military readiness and market sensitivity created a feedback loop that demanded continuous monitoring. As these hours progressed, subtle signs hinted at wider implications. Analysts indicated that what was initially framed as a demonstration of deterrence might instead be interpreted internationally as overreach or miscalculation. Diplomatic backchannels were reportedly active, conveying cautionary signals, yet the exact response calculus in Moscow remained opaque. Experts noted that the combination of nuclear readiness and ambiguous public communication risked undermining strategic credibility, creating a tension that could spiral unpredictably if unaddressed. The unfolding narrative suggested that even minor deviations in nuclear posture could produce outsized strategic consequences. Signals intelligence, operational anomalies, and market sensitivity converged into a scenario where conventional assumptions were challenged. What appeared as routine maneuvers on the surface were revealing a complex interaction between intent, perception, and operational execution. At this stage, observers recognized that the day's events might be marking a turning point, a moment when strategic signaling collided with systemic limits. Perhaps it is worth following closely. Some sources suggest that this episode is only the first in a series of reactions whose scale and consequence are not yet fully understood. But further developments would soon show that the apparent demonstration of power was only one layer of a far more intricate scenario, one in which miscalculation and perception threatened to redefine the bounds of control. By midday, the operational patterns of Russia's strategic forces had become clearer, though the full implications were only beginning to be assessed. Detailed satellite and signals intelligence indicated that multiple missile units were maintaining elevated readiness, with some assets positioned in configurations that exceeded routine exercise parameters. Official statements emphasized that the deployments were part of scheduled drills, yet internal observers noted deviations in timing, coordination, and communications that suggested heightened alert beyond the intended scope. In expert circles, this was interpreted as an early signal of systemic stress in command structures. Analysts monitoring command and control communications identified subtle discrepancies in verification protocols and reporting channels. While publicly described as routine, these anomalies raised questions about the coherence of decision-making across strategic units. Observers noted that even small inconsistencies in nuclear command procedures could have outsized implications, particularly when interpreted by external intelligence services. In several capitals, analysts were quietly reassessing risk matrices and contingency plans, considering both deliberate and accidental escalation scenarios. The response of international actors was measured but significant. Intelligence sharing between allied nations intensified, with back-channel assessments emphasizing precautionary readiness rather than alarm. Financial markets linked to defense and energy sectors registered subtle movements, reflecting uncertainty in geopolitical risk. Observers highlighted the tension between public reassurance and private recalibration, noting that perception alone could amplify strategic misjudgments. The apparent stability in statements contrasted sharply with the heightened activity observed in real-time monitoring. Internally, reports indicated that senior Russian officials were reviewing operational directives. Measures reportedly included additional verification steps, reassignment of personnel, and close monitoring of deployed missile systems. Sources familiar with the procedures suggested that these adjustments reflected a cautious approach to ensure continuity of command while preventing misinterpretation of signals. Analysts noted that even with these safeguards, the day's events had revealed vulnerabilities in both operational execution and strategic signaling. Meanwhile, the implications for regional security were already surfacing. European and East Asian analysts observed potential ripple effects on nuclear posture, missile defense readiness, and broader military planning. Even routine exercises, when perceived ambiguously by other actors, could trigger adjustments in alert levels, deployment schedules, and diplomatic signaling. The day's scenario highlighted how closely operational behavior, perception, and strategic communication were intertwined. Small deviations could rapidly amplify into significant reactions, illustrating the fragility of apparent control. In financial and strategic forums, discussions emphasized the importance of monitoring both observable movements and intangible signals. Analysts noted that the combination of operational anomalies and ambiguous messaging created a high-sensitivity environment, where interpretation of intent became as critical as the physical positioning of assets. Decision-makers in multiple regions were adjusting both posture and policy to account for the potential escalation of misperceived threats, underscoring the interconnected nature of modern strategic dynamics. At this point, the day's events were beginning to reveal the limits of conventional assessments. Routine drills, intended to demonstrate capability and deterrence, were producing complex reverberations across operational, diplomatic, and market domains. Analysts highlighted that the observable effects were only one layer of a multidimensional scenario, where hidden operational friction, miscommunication, and external interpretation could converge into consequences far beyond the initial exercise. For those observing closely, the recommendation was clear: maintain continuous situational awareness, track deviations in real time, and consider both intentional and accidental escalation pathways. Even in the absence of explicit confirmation, the day had demonstrated that nuclear signaling, operational posture, and perception were inextricably linked, and that small anomalies could carry disproportionate weight. The unfolding situation emphasized the importance of vigilance, as what appeared to be a controlled demonstration of strength was increasingly revealing systemic vulnerabilities. As these hours progressed, a subtle yet unmistakable pattern emerged. Analysts suggested that the day's activities were not simply a demonstration of strategic readiness, but also a test of the boundaries of control, signaling, and international perception. Observers concluded that the interplay of operational execution, command coherence, and external interpretation had created a scenario where routine procedures collided with real-time strategic consequences, setting the stage for deeper insights into systemic risks and vulnerabilities. However, as the day unfolded, the surface narrative began to unravel. Internal reports indicated that several missile units were experiencing coordination friction that had not been anticipated in planning documents. Communication delays between command centers and field units created brief but significant discrepancies in readiness signals. Analysts observing these anomalies noted that even minor timing mismatches in nuclear command protocols could be interpreted externally as escalation, potentially triggering defensive or retaliatory postures by other nuclear-armed states. The controlled exercise was, unexpectedly, showing cracks in execution. Satellite imagery and electronic surveillance suggested that some strategic missile deployments were not following the standard exercise templates. Storage sites, launch pads, and transport vehicles were positioned in ways that deviated from declared plans. Although officials maintained that all actions were within exercise parameters, the observable anomalies indicated internal confusion or misalignment. Expert observers interpreted these deviations as early signs that the exercise's intended message of deterrence was being compromised, replaced instead by signals of operational uncertainty. Between the lines of official communication, the evidence suggested that systemic strain was emerging within Russia's strategic command apparatus. In multiple capitals, intelligence assessments began to flag a rising risk of misperception. Analysts emphasized that even controlled maneuvers, when executed with minor deviations, could be misinterpreted as deliberate escalation. Diplomatic backchannels were reportedly active, transmitting cautionary signals and requesting clarification, yet Moscow's messaging remained consistent with prior statements. This contrast heightened tension. While the exercise was designed to assert strategic capability, its execution appeared to be eroding credibility rather than reinforcing it. Experts noted that the interplay of internal procedural stress and external observation was creating an unintentional strategic dilemma. Internally, senior officials were reportedly convening urgent operational reviews. Adjustments included additional verification steps for launch orders, cross-checking command signals, and realigning units to restore procedural coherence. Sources familiar with these discussions suggested that the interventions were reactive, aimed at preventing miscommunication from escalating into perceived threat. Analysts highlighted that even these corrective measures carried risks. Increased activity and visibility of units could themselves be interpreted externally as heightened alert, amplifying the unintended signal. Meanwhile, financial and defense-linked markets reacted subtly but discernibly. Volatility in commodity and security indices reflected heightened sensitivity to geopolitical instability. Analysts emphasized that market actors were responding to perception rather than confirmed threat, demonstrating how quickly routine exercises could influence both economic and strategic calculations. The combination of operational friction, ambiguous signals, and market interpretation underscored the fragility inherent in high-stakes deterrence frameworks. Observers tracking command coherence reported that the misalignment of units had wider implications. Simulation models suggested that if minor discrepancies were compounded, the risk of misperception by other nuclear actors could escalate, producing a chain reaction of precautionary measures. Analysts noted that even without overt escalation, the exercise was creating a feedback loop where operational reality, perception, and strategic signaling were influencing each other in real time. What had been intended as a demonstration of strength was evolving into a cautionary example of how tightly interwoven intent and execution must be. At the same time, intelligence indicated that international military and strategic monitoring was intensifying. Early warning systems and allied tracking protocols were detecting anomalies that were being carefully scrutinized. Experts in these capitals suggested that the day's exercise, once viewed as routine, now required constant observation to prevent misinterpretation. The strategic calculus was shifting. Actions designed to reinforce deterrence were now producing uncertainty, a reminder that even well-planned maneuvers could backfire under the scrutiny of real-time observation. By midday, a quiet but decisive understanding emerged among informed observers. The exercise was no longer solely a demonstration of power, but also a live test of systemic limits. Operational misalignments, ambiguous communication, and international perception had converged, creating an unanticipated tension. Analysts emphasized that, in this environment, the consequences were not hypothetical, they were unfolding in real time, with small deviations carrying disproportionate weight. For those following the developments, the recommendation was clear: maintain vigilance, monitor real-time signals, and interpret both visible actions and hidden operational cues. Some sources suggested that the unfolding scenario could be the first in a series of events that would reveal vulnerabilities in both strategic posture and decision-making structures. At this stage, it was becoming evident that the exercise had inadvertently exposed weaknesses, turning a demonstration of nuclear capability into a high-stakes test of control, perception, and credibility. As the day progressed, the repercussions of the misaligned missile exercise became increasingly visible. Reports indicated that multiple strategic units were maintaining alert postures beyond routine parameters, creating an operational footprint that was being closely tracked by foreign intelligence and early warning systems. Observers noted that the heightened visibility of assets, combined with minor procedural anomalies, magnified the perceived risk of escalation, transforming what was intended as a controlled demonstration into a high-stakes geopolitical signal. The complexity of the situation was compounded by real-time monitoring across multiple nations, all interpreting subtle variations in deployment as potential indicators of intent. Financial markets and defense-sensitive sectors began registering measurable responses. Volatility in commodities and equities correlated with geopolitical risk, reflecting the sensitivity of market actors to strategic ambiguity. Analysts highlighted that perception alone, amplified by operational misalignment, could trigger defensive or hedging behavior with tangible economic consequences. The interplay between strategic signaling and market interpretation had become a feedback loop. Each new adjustment in Russian posture prompted recalibrations elsewhere, which in turn influenced further operational decisions. The day's exercise was no longer confined to military signaling, it was now reverberating across global systems. Internally, Russian command was reportedly enacting rapid corrective measures. Coordination efforts included re-establishing verification protocols, ensuring that missile readiness signals matched intended exercise parameters, and adjusting communications to reduce potential for misinterpretation. Sources indicated that these steps were reactive, intended to prevent the exercise from being read as a prelude to escalation. Analysts noted that the increased activity, while operationally necessary, paradoxically risked amplifying international perception of heightened alert. The situation underscored a core paradox: measures to reduce misperception could themselves create new signals requiring interpretation. Diplomatic backchannels were reportedly active in parallel. Analysts suggested that allied and partner nations were engaging in continuous evaluation of risk, consulting intelligence reports and monitoring asset movements to determine the likelihood of inadvertent escalation. The juxtaposition of Moscow's official messaging with observable anomalies created a challenging environment for both policymakers and analysts. Even routine exercises were being reframed as strategic tests with real-time consequences, highlighting how perception and operational fidelity had become inseparable in modern nuclear posture management. Emerging intelligence indicated that the exercise's unintended consequences were producing cascading effects on decision-making. Regional military commands and strategic units were reportedly reviewing protocols, evaluating potential responses to perceived signals, and recalibrating alert statuses. Analysts emphasized that the cumulative effect of minor deviations could, in aggregate, trigger precautionary measures that were disproportionate to the exercise's intended message. The day's events demonstrated how quickly strategic intent could be overshadowed by the realities of operational execution and international interpretation. Observers also noted that the exercise had revealed vulnerabilities in information flow and command coherence. Even a carefully structured demonstration of capability was susceptible to misalignment between intent and execution. Analysts in multiple capitals highlighted that the current scenario offered lessons in systemic fragility. Subtle procedural deviations, when combined with heightened monitoring and ambiguous messaging, could unintentionally escalate risk. The exercise had exposed not only operational weaknesses but also the intricate interplay between internal coordination, perception, and international response. At the strategic level, the day's events were being interpreted as a cautionary example of how nuclear signaling could backfire. Experts emphasized that credibility in deterrence depends not only on capability but also on coherence, transparency, and timing. The misalignment between the exercise's intended demonstration and its observable execution had created tension in international assessments, requiring rapid adjustment and heightened vigilance. Analysts suggested that the scenario was effectively a live stress test, revealing how minor anomalies in posture could ripple across operational, diplomatic, and economic domains. By midday, it was evident that the exercise had transitioned from a demonstration of strength to a complex sequence of adaptive responses. Operational corrections, international monitoring, market recalibrations, and diplomatic consultations were all occurring simultaneously, creating a multidimensional landscape of influence and risk. The visible calm of official statements masked the intense activity behind the scenes, underscoring the fragility of perception and the potential for inadvertent escalation. Yet even as operational adjustments were implemented, sources indicated that the strategic fallout was still unfolding. The day's events had highlighted the limits of control, demonstrating that nuclear signaling and perception management are inseparably linked, and that small deviations can have disproportionately large consequences. Observers noted that what appeared to be a routine exercise had evolved into a multi-layered scenario, where the convergence of operational friction, strategic signaling, and international perception was dictating both immediate and anticipatory responses. However, behind the official calm, a far more complex game was emerging, one that threatened to redefine assumptions about control, credibility, and the delicate balance of strategic deterrence. By midday, the broader consequences of the missile exercise had become increasingly apparent, though much remained obscured from public view. Across strategic and diplomatic circles, analysts were recalibrating assessments, noting that the alignment of units, the deviations from expected protocols, and the subtle anomalies in communications had collectively exposed vulnerabilities in both operational control and strategic signaling. What had begun as a demonstration of nuclear capability was now interpreted as a scenario that tested systemic limits, revealing the fragility inherent in even carefully orchestrated deterrence measures. In multiple capitals, intelligence updates were being cross-referenced with real-time monitoring of deployments and command communications. Analysts emphasized that the day's events were a vivid demonstration of how perception, operational coherence, and strategic intent are inextricably linked. Small discrepancies in execution, when combined with international observation, had the potential to create outsized effects. Market and policy responses were being influenced not only by tangible movements but by interpretations of intent, underscoring the increasingly interconnected nature of global strategic risk. Within Russia, internal assessments reportedly focused on recalibrating command fidelity and mitigating unintended signals. Additional verification protocols, cross-checking of readiness reports, and operational adjustments were implemented to restore alignment. Yet observers noted that even these corrective measures carried their own risks. The increased activity required for internal coordination could be misinterpreted externally, further complicating the narrative. Analysts highlighted that this delicate balancing act between internal control and external perception had defined the trajectory of the day's